Myoho Renge Kyo Nam. Myoho Renge Kyo Nam. Myoho Renge Kyo. All right, well, let us continue. So, we left off. And this is, who's talking here? So this is still Nichiren talking to his interlocutor, both of which are Nichiren. Again, there may be those who commit the 4 grave offenses, or are guilty of the 5 cardinal sins, and who, though aware that they are guilty of serious faults, from the beginning have no trace of fear or contrition in their hearts, or, if they do, give no outward sign of it. When it comes to the correct teachings, they show no inclination to protect, treasure, and establish it over the ages, but rather speak of it with malice and contempt, their words replete with error. Excuse me. People of this kind, too, I would say, are following the path of the Ichantika. With the exception of this one group of people called Ichantika, however, you may offer alms to all others, and everyone will praise you. Now I recognize that we already read that part, so let me continue a little further on. Something just jumped into my throat, so I apologize, as well as my congestion. I'm a mess. In another passage it says, in the past, when the thus come one was the ruler of a nation and practiced the way of the Bodhisattva, he put to death a number of Brahmins. Again, it says, there are 3 degrees of killings, the lower, middle, and upper degrees. The lower degrees constitute the killing of any humble being, from an ant to any of the various kinds of animals. But the killing of any being that a bodhisattva has chosen to be born as, to helping other living beings, is excluded. As a result of a killing of the lower degree, one will fall into the realms of hell, hungry spirits, and animals, and will suffer all the pains appropriate to a killing of the lower degree. Now, if you haven't watched my videos on the 10 worlds, or you're not familiar with the 10 worlds, you would do well to catch up a little bit. Again, as I read the Gosho, we're into Nichiren now, there's a lot of assumed knowledge base. So when he talks about falling into these other worlds, the hells, angry spirits, and so forth, these are not like in most Western or religious beliefs where these are other places we go, like purgatories and hells and heavens and so forth. These are life conditions. This is where we live in this life. So I'm going to continue reminding you of that because it's easy to slip and start thinking mystically and magically about the stuff it's not. Why should this be? Because even animals and other humble beings possess the roots of goodness, insignificant though those roots may be. This is why a person who kills such a being must suffer full retribution for this offense. Your life will be affected by it. Killing any persons, from an ordinary mortal to an anagamin, constitutes what is termed the middle degree. As a consequence of such an act of killing, one will fall into the realms of hell, hungry spirits, and animals, and will suffer all the pains appropriate to the killing of a middle degree. The upper degree of killing refers to the killing of a parent, an arhat, a pratyakabuddha, or a bodhisattva, who has reached the stage of non-retrogression. For such a crime, one will fall into the great Avicii hell. Good men, if someone were to kill an Ichantika, that killing would not fall into any of the three categories just mentioned. Good men, the various Brahmins that I have said were put to death, all of them were in fact Ichantikas. In the Benevolent King's Sutra, we read, the Buddha announced to King Prasthajit, thus I entrust the protection of my teachings to the ruler of the nation rather than to the monks and nuns. Why do I do so? Because they do not possess the kind of power and authority that the king has. The Nirvana Sutra states, now I entrust the correct teachings, which is unexcelled, to the rulers, the ministers, the high officials, and the four kinds of Buddhists. Men, women, monks, and lay people. If anyone should vilify the correct teaching, then the ministers and the four kinds of Buddhists should reprimand him and bring him to order. It also states, the Buddha replied, Bodhisattva Kashyapa, it is because I was a defender of the correct teaching that I have been able to attain this diamond-like body. Good men, defenders of the correct teaching need not observe the 5 precepts or practice the rules of proper behavior. Rather, they should carry knives and swords, bows and arrows, halberds and lances. Again, the Buddha said, even though there may be those who observe the 5 precepts, they do not deserve to be called practitioners of the great vehicle. But even if one does not observe the 5 precepts, if one defends the correct teachings, then one may be called a practitioner of the great vehicle. Defenders of the correct teaching ought to arm themselves with knives and swords, weapons and staves. Even though they carry swords and staves, I would call them men who observe the precepts. The Buddha likewise said, good man, in past ages, in the very city Akashinagara, a Buddha appeared whose name was the thus come one, joy increasing. After this Buddha passed away, the correct teaching that he had taught remained in the world for countless millions of years. Finally, only 40 more years were left before the Buddha's teachings was due to come to an end. At that time, there was a monk named Realization of Virtue who observed the precepts. There were many monks at this time who violated the precepts. And when they heard this monk preaching, they all conceived evil designs in their hearts and, arming themselves with swords and staves, approached the teacher of the law. At this time, the ruler of the kingdom was named Possessor of Virtue. He received reports of what was happening, and in order to defend the teaching, he went at once to the palace where the monk was preaching the law, or the place where the monk was preaching the law, and fought with all his might against the evil monks who broke the precepts. As a result, the monk who had been preaching was able to escape grievous injury, but the king received so many wounds from the knives and swords, halberds and lances, that there was not a spot on his body the size of a mustard seed that remained unharmed. At this time, the monk Realization of Virtue praised the king, saying, Splendid, splendid, you, O king, are now a true defender of the correct teaching. In ages to come, this body of yours will surely become a boundless vessel of the law. At that time, the king had already heard the teaching, and he felt great joy in his heart. Thereupon, his life came to an end, and he was reborn in the land of Buddha Akshobha, where he became the Buddha's principal disciple. Moreover, all the military leaders, citizens, and associates of the king who had fought beside him or had rejoiced in his effort were filled with an unflagging determination to achieve enlightenment, and when they all died, all of them were reborn in the land of Buddha Akshobhya. Later, the monk Realization of Virtue also died, and he too was reborn in the land of Buddha Akshobhya, where he became second among the Buddha's voice hearers, disciples. Thus, if the correct teaching is about to come to an end, this is the way one ought to support and defend it. So, let's go on. Kashyapa, the king who lived at that time, was I myself. And the monk who preached was the Buddha Kashyapa. Kashyapa, those who defend the correct teaching enjoy this kind of boundless reward. As a consequence, I have been able to obtain the distinguished characteristics that I possess today, to adorn myself with them, and to put on the Dharma body that can never be destroyed. Then the Buddha declared to Bodhisattva Kashyapa, for this reason, laymen, believers, and others who wish to defend the law should arm themselves with swords and staves and protect it in this manner. Good man, in the age of impurity and evil, after I have passed away, the nation will fall into devastation and disorder, when men will plunder and steal from one another, and the common people will be reduced to starvation. Because of hunger, many men at the time will declare their determination to leave their families and become monks. Men such as these may be called shave-pates. When this crowd of shave-pates see anyone who is attempting to protect the correct teachings, they will chase after him and drive him away, or even kill him, or do him injury. That is why I now give permission for monks who observe the precepts to associate with keep company with white-robed laymen who bear swords and staves. Even though they carry swords and staves, I would call them men who observe the precepts. But although they may carry swords and staves, they should never use them to take life. So what does all this mean? And there's plenty more to read. But I want to stop there because I want to hit a point here. This story is very engrossing. And it seems to the casual reader as though Buddha is saying, it's not good to kill insects and animals. It's not good to kill ordinary people who aren't pursuing enlightenment, and it's very, very terrible to kill somebody who's practicing Buddhism correctly. In other words, somebody who's practicing Buddhism correctly in all of the teachings, and talking to others as a bodhisattva to help them attain and study broadly all the teachings of Buddhism, so that there's no ego, there's no bias in any manner. But then he throws in a caveat, especially for those who would be practicing Buddhism but don't practice it, looking for a word here I could use, honorably. And by that I have to define honorably as somebody who respects the entirety of the teachings, who remains humble, and who acts as a facilitator and teacher to others to raise their life condition and awareness without any self-aggrandizement or any need for I always resort to ego, because ultimately that's where all of that ends up. But suffice it to say that he's not justifying killing. What he's doing is he's saying, in some times of man in the human condition, we are peace-loving, equanimity practicing Buddhists who want to live life fully and appreciate the awe and preciousness of life. But that doesn't make us doormats, or what a lot of people would, the minute they hear the word Buddhist, they say, oh, you're pacifists. No, we want peace and we want no violence, but we're not stupid enough or ignorant enough to believe that just because we want it, it'll occur. So Buddha is saying sometimes you need to either yourself or associate with others who will, though they may not practice as monks, they are strong supporters of what the monks do, the monks who keep the correct precepts, and they will defend. They need to be equipped. Somebody comes running at you with a sword, you need to have a sword to stop them. There's there's an old saying from early martial arts training I wish I could remember it exactly, but basically, paraphrasing, it goes like this. If attacked, knock a person down rather than being cut or injured. Break a finger rather than an arm. Break an arm rather than sever a limb. Sever a limb rather than take a life. The saying, again, reinforces this idea that sometimes you need to be prepared to defend yourself, and that may be a violent act. But once again, now, I'm going to bring this all back around to a very simple thing that you can use as a litmus test for anything for any kind of interaction with others. Buddhism is about attitude and your intent. Now you might say, well, the guy who wants to cut your head off, maybe his intent is, he sees you as wicked and he wants to kill the wicked. And I would say to you that that is not the Buddhist way, is it? That is not following correct teaching, because in that will, though you may say, and you may be correct in saying, that person has a distorted view and a distorted mind, but that's the point. They're killing for the sake of killing. They're not protecting anything, they're attacking. Nichiren is using strong words here to put everyone around him in their place. These older teachings that have been accepted are not correct, and he is correcting them. But he's not ransacking their temples. He's not running after them and castigating them. He has an interlocutor. He's saying, what about this? And he's saying, no uncertain terms. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Listen, this. His intent isn't to cause harm. Do you see? He vociferously fights against these people who aren't practicing correctly. But he's not doing it with the intent of harm. He's doing it with the intent of correction, of stopping their progress and English I can't think of the word. Not encouraging, but exhorting them to see the correct teaching and the fallacy of their ways. And like having staves and swords, he may use some harsh words, but they're words, and the words with the intent are correct. The same words with destructive and defamatory intent, not correct. It can be a very obvious point, it can be a very subtle point. But it always comes down to, and you got to check yourself. Sometimes we adopt a certain justification for ourselves, and we forget to check. We get going with so much zeal, and we suddenly, I slipped. I had the right intent at first, but at some point in the argument, or at some point in the day, or at some point when something happened, my animal side came out, and I was really kind of vengeful, and I really need to chant about that. I need to expurgate that. I'm human. It's going to happen, but I need to address it immediately with myself and others, whoever I reached. Okay? So that's a very important part of this discussion. Once again, another aspect of correctness. What is correctness? What is the correct practice? How it's all about mental attitude. Even when we chant, when we met, this is, by the way, why Nichiren is so important to the history and scholarship of Buddhism, because what he came to, what he discovered, was that in the Lotus Sutra, what you have is like a PhD, okay? If you, without having gone to junior high, high school, preparatory school, college, gotten your graduate degrees, and you just run into a school and say, I want to apply for a PhD, the chances are very, very minimal that you're going to get there, right? I mean, forget the legal boundaries and all that. I'm just saying, intellectually, it's going to be tough. So it's important that, in school we call them prerequisites, right? So in a way, in Buddhism, you could say that all of the earlier teachings of Buddhism are prerequisites. They teach certain valuable lessons that once you inculcate them in your thinking and you understand them deeply, when you get to the Lotus Sutra, now you can get your PhD, because now it's going to make sense. I practiced and read the PhD, the Lotus Sutra, for a couple of years before I really started expanding my. I studied other things, but it wasn't. It was hard at that time actually to find a lot of other stuff that was in the scholarship of Buddhism. There was a lot of fantasy books fictions, and opinions and such. But I finally got to the research, finally changed my karma, I guess, enough that I started finding and getting access to scholarship in Buddhism. And when I did that, the first time I read another sutra, I'm trying to remember which sutra it was, but regardless, the first time I read another sutra outside of the Lotus Sutra, it may have been the Nirvana, but anyway, no, there was something before that. Suddenly there were things in the Lotus Sutra that just, now I get that. Now I know what he's saying. I couldn't get those answers from the group I was practicing with because they were so narrowly congested in the Lotus Sutra that they themselves just took it as rote. And see, that's dangerous. You can't ever do that. You must understand, and this is what Shakyamuni Buddha taught, this is what Nichiren taught, this is what every scholar of Buddhism, within Buddhism, has taught over and over and over again. Even Julius Evola from the early 20th century, Italian explorer who went into the Indus Valley, wrote a book called, I think, On Awakening. He was very, very animated. You can read it in the book. You feel his energy, his excitement about this discovery, and this isn't what other people are saying. Listen to the precision and the da-da-da. He was really into it. Because there's something about the study of Buddhism that connects so viscerally with what we already know. But our monkey mind, our human mind, doesn't know to know it, if that makes sense. So here we are in this one of Nichiren's major writings, and he's just one by one chipping away at this interlocutor who sees him as a really horrible monk at the beginning, certainly gets angrier and angrier until finally Nichiren starts coming at this from so many different ways that this interlocutor is like, yeah, it's like you make too much sense for me to ignore. I may have to change my position. It's a pretty smart interlocutor. I don't think most of us are that quick to change our minds about stuff. I like to think I am, but I'm still human. So I think this is an aspect of studying Nichiren that you'll only learn once you've studied previous sutra and you come to Nichiren with this basic knowledge. And then as you read Nichiren, you can start to see how he crafts his way of teaching, his way of exposure to correct interpretation and scholarship of the teachings. Especially given that he's living at a time where people just whip out their sword and chop your head off. Samurai are like, they have quite a storied history. But as much as they would develop strength of mind, in other words, you might call it tolerance today or patience, I think maybe a better word for it would be restraint. When enough was enough, they just made a decision. It wasn't up for negotiation. So living in those times was a bit precarious, right? So I'm going to read a little bit more. I want to keep these videos shorter this year. The Lotus and the Nirvana Sutras represent the very heart of the doctrines that Shakyamuni preached during the 5 periods of his teaching life. Their warnings must be viewed with the utmost gravity. Who would fail to heed them? And yet those people who forget about the correct way and slander the law put more trust than ever in Honen's Nembutsu chosen above all, and grow blinder than ever in their foolishness. So he's brought it full circle around. This is what I'm talking about, right? I want to make a point here, too, that the Lotus Sutra, the characters, Namu, Myoho Renge Kyo, specifically those 5 characters, Myoho Renge Kyo. I have other videos. You can look them up, and I have a paper on the resource site that I have up on the 5 characters, Myoho Renge Kyo, and how... and this is one of the things you need to understand by the time you get to Nichiren, that when you vocalize these words, these characters, really, these sounds, Myoho Renge Kyo, you are vocalizing the 5 periods of teaching. You are vocalizing the entire scholarship in your PhD practice. Do you see? So don't forget, it's not just a magic word. There's heavy representation and knowledge involved in this practice. And this is also why, if you short-circuit yourself and you practice only that, you'll be under the false impression that you're chanting a magic spell, when in fact, even if somebody might use those words, the intent, the attitude about it is, I have all this hysteresis, all of this knowledge about the representation of those different aspects of self-knowing, knowing the mind, the science of the mind, so that when I invoke those words, I'm not just making magic sounds, I'm invoking that knowledge, that awakening. This is why Daimoku works, okay? And I think on that, that's long enough. We'll continue with more from Nichiren. Sounds like a commercial on the next episode. Anyway, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I hope that I'm opening some doors and windows for you so you can get a lot of light into your house of knowledge. And I don't know where that came from, but thanks again. Namo Myoho Renge Kyo. I'll see you real soon.